As we've heard from our keynote speaker, data integrity can be a major issue in the pharma industry and the research community. So, for example, we've seen some regulatory actions from some of the bigger data integrity cases that have resulted in rejection of marketing authorization applications. They've also resulted in the removal of medicines from the market, some recalls, and also some reputational damage for those organizations concerned as well. But it's not a new issue. Data integrity is not a new issue. And all of the basic data integrity requirements are already outlined in international guidance and in regulations. Some of the things we often hear in relation to data integrity are, data integrity is only about preventing deliberate acts of fraud, or, well, I'm not using electronic data and I'm not using any electronic systems, so I don't really need to worry about data integrity. Obviously, neither of those are true, and I hope to cover some of that this morning. The learning objectives for this session are to understand why data integrity is a fundamental requirement, how to approach data integrity based on risk related to criticality of the data, how organisational culture can affect data integrity, and also how lack of control of data integrity can lead to findings on inspection. So I've got some examples for you at the end of my presentation. So there's been a lot of talk about data integrity recently, but it's always been at the heart of what we do. And we know decisions are made on data. And data integrity really allows us to have data which can be reconstructed and obviously be traceable, which is why it's a fundamental element and a key objective of any regulatory inspection and assessment, and obviously why it's really key for any GXP discipline. But it's not new. What is new is the way that that data is being generated. So ways of working are changing. We've seen changes in technology, we've seen new electronic systems, complexity has changed, so global clinical trials have become more complex. There are many more vendors that are being involved in clinical trials, so many more players that are coming together to gather that data and for it to be processed. But the regulatory view is still exactly the same. Do we have confidence in the integrity of that data? So it's still exactly the same question, regardless of how that data is being gathered. As I said, there's been a lot of interest in data integrity recently, and this has resulted in a number of different guidance documents being generated. So MHRA have published a GXP guide recently. HICS, that's a Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, which some of you hopefully may have heard of, have also produced some guidance. EMA have also produced some questions and answers that they've published on their website. WHO have also got some guidance out. Chinese FDA also a little while ago produced some draft guidance on data management and data integrity. So with the production of this guidance, there has been a degree of regulatory and industry collaboration. And what that means is, hopefully, that we're already seeing some convergence in terms of what the expectations are for data integrity. Hopefully, this is good news for industry, and good news for shared regulatory oversight of clinical trials as well. So this kind of collaboration hopefully starts to build confidence in the exchange of information between regulators, and also what we're doing in terms of joint inspections, if we're looking at the same things, and also any coordination of regulatory actions that we might need to take post those inspections. What we've seen is that certainly between inspectorates and international regulators, we're seeing shared expectations, we're seeing some common training as well, so expertise is being shared amongst the regulators, an exchange of information on any key issues we're seeing in terms of data integrity, and also a move towards joint inspections if there are particular issues that we want to look at, or if we're looking really for training opportunities as well. So I think this is quite encouraging, really, in terms of the regulatory partners and also industry having a look at data integrity and really starting to come to the same conclusions and having shared expectations. So looking at the different guidance that's out there, I think there are many common themes in what's been published. So things like data risk, criticality, and lifecycle are terminology that you'll see in all of the different guidance documents. And also this concept that it's applicable to both electronic and paper records. It's not just about electronic data. We're also seeing a lot about mapping of data processes and data lifecycle. And this is a theme you're going to see and hear repeated throughout today as well. Also looking at a risk risk-based approach, so identifying data with the greatest GXP impact, so what's really important, and also looking at risk-based controls and review of data as well. So looking at what's most effective and what's most efficient in an organisation. In our MHRA document on data integrity, we talk about a data lifecycle. So this really is what happens to the data from when it's being produced, when it's being generated and collected, all the way through to when it possibly might be destroyed. So data might be transmitted and processed, it'll be analysed and reported, it would need to be retrieved, that might be for regulatory inspection, but also reconstruction of the clinical trial. It will also need to be, eventually might need to be destroyed as well. So when we talk about data integrity, we're talking about the extent to which all that data is complete, it's consistent, it's accurate, and it's trustworthy. And also what that means for data integrity is that it stays in that state throughout that particular life cycle. So we're going to keep coming back to that theme in terms of what that means. So as I said previously, data integrity applies to systems that involve manual processes and paper, as well as computerized systems as well. Part of that process are people. That's a really important part of the process, and that really shouldn't be forgotten either. So training of staff, and also the management culture has a big impact on data integrity, and we're going to come back to culture in a moment and look at that in a little bit more detail. So that's a culture that really accepts that mistakes may be made. So it looks for continuous improvement rather than looking to blame somebody if something's gone wrong. So just as an example for that, we saw on inspection fairly recently, there was an issue with training records. One member of staff just wasn't updating their training records in a timely manner. The corrective and preventative action that we got back following that inspection was that that person had been terminated. I'm hoping that what they meant was their contract had been terminated and not the person themselves. That seems overly harsh. But you can see if there's a management culture that behaves in that way, it's never going to encourage open reporting of any issues that might have gone wrong. So that's always going to create some kind of atmosphere of fear, which means that issues could be hidden and things could go wrong, and you may not know about them until it's much too late. Data integrity controls. Obviously, we expect that there are controls in place to preserve data integrity, but it doesn't mean you have to review every single data point. So again, this can be done on a risk-based approach depending on what's really important. So we'd expect you to be reviewing data sets, so as they were generated, but also have in place periodic system review. So really by that we mean audit. So looking at an audit which would look at the effectiveness of the data controls that you have in place. Hopefully it goes without saying that we expect organisations to have systems and procedures in place to manage data integrity, to manage the control of data integrity. And if any risk-based approach have been applied to that, then that's obviously something that's documented, and the supporting rationale should also be documented. Obviously, it needs to be fit for purpose and include the people aspect as well as computerized system aspects as well. There are some simple things to think about as well when you're thinking about data integrity and thinking about the system that you've got in place to support that. So it's really making things as simple as possible for people that are collecting that data. So just simple things such as ease of use of forms. Are they easy to complete? Are they not ambiguous? But also thinking about things like appropriate user access rights, so making sure the systems that you're using prevent any unauthorized edits, so you're not allowing people to enter data or change data when they shouldn't be. But also thinking about physical layout. So if you're doing a task, let's say, for example, you're collecting data in a laboratory and you're collecting data, whether that's on electronic form or whether that's on a piece of paper. Is it all set out nicely in the laboratory? So is everything easy to pick up in terms of your equipment, your space, and your time? So you're not moving around from space to space, filling out a form, coming back and doing something else. So really thinking about what's the simplest way to manage your data. The oversight of data integrity is really managed by something that we call data governance. So these are, I'll just read it out to you, these are the arrangements to ensure that data, irrespective of the format in which they're generated, are recorded, they're processed and retained in order to ensure the record throughout that data lifecycle. And obviously data governance is something that applies to the whole lifecycle. So what we would expect to see is that within an organisation, this addresses ownership and accountability. So who's really responsible for data integrity? So that needs to include monitoring and control of processes and systems. Also, again, needs to include staff training as well, so we mustn't forget them. And also, good data governance should ensure that risks can be identified in an ongoing manner, and also to minimise any of those risks that you might have identified in terms of data integrity. Oversight and data governance also applies to third parties. So if you're contracting out any of your data processing, then you also need to make sure that the contracts include things like data ownership and governance, and also accessibility and retention of any data. So this really must be included in any contract or technical agreement. Data governance systems also need to make sure that data are readily available. So for inspection, certainly for MHRA, we have the right to have direct access to any electronic systems. So when you're building a system, you need to make sure that's directly accessible to inspectors on request. And obviously, it's something that doesn't take a long time to set up as well. Might sound like I'm stating the obvious, but electronic data should be available in human-readable form. We have seen quite often when we visit investigator sites that the data that was contained in electronic CRFs has been given back to the investigator, but it's not really in a format that they can really read. So it's not something that's as simple as clicking on a file, opening it up, and being able to read the data. And we've also seen data that's been given in outdated formats as well. So recently, just a couple of months ago, we saw floppy disks in part of a TMF. And nobody has the equipment to read those anymore. So I mean, that's just something that's particularly useless as part of a trial master file as well. Okay. I want to talk about culture. I think management culture in terms of data integrity is really, really important. Part of that culture needs to be that the people that are managing that data understand that issues can happen. It can happen here. It's not just something that happens to somebody else. So senior leaders really need to be able to demonstrate good leadership in terms of data integrity, and also to be able to communicate realistic expectations. So by that I mean, if you've got systems and procedures, they need to be aligned with what the organisation can actually manage. So it needs to be something that's akin to what you've got in terms of resourcing, so staffing and resourcing levels as well. That you're not expecting a huge amount of your staff that's just impossible to achieve in the time that you've got. Another important feature when you're looking at organisational behaviour is having evidence of an open culture, so open reporting mechanisms. So by that I mean that you've got a management culture that encourages reporting, and it's not something that's punished if you report issues. And also that if issues are reported, that there's proportionate investigation of errors and data integrity failure. And I think that goes for industry as well as regulators. Obviously, we need to be proportionate in our approaches to any data integrity issues. So, for example, in the UK, there's a requirement to report any serious breaches into us. We get reported probably about 100 every year. And what usually happens is the organisation will report into us what the breach is, what the investigation is into why that breach happened, and some corrective and preventative action to go along with that. Generally, that's not going to trigger an inspection. What we do is we work with the organisation to look at the CAPA. We might have some extra questions and some suggestions. But essentially, if we're happy with that CAPA, we can then close that breach out. We're well aware that if we triggered an inspection, every time we received a serious breach, we probably wouldn't get many breaches reported into us. So when we do receive serious breaches, what that tells us is that organisation has in place systems and procedures to identify when issues happen. They are able to report them and obviously able to take corrective action to make sure they don't happen again. So that doesn't necessarily mean that all the organisations that have never reported serious breaches into us are all 100% compliant. It could be that they don't have the systems and procedures in place, or they don't have the right culture in place in order to make sure that those issues are reported and that they're dealt with. So as I said, an open culture is really important, and people should be able to report any issues regardless of seniority. So hierarchy should be able to be challenged, and it shouldn't stand in the way of people reporting any issues. Personnel empowerment is also important. So understanding what the data is that you're dealing with. So in GCP, do people understand what impact that data has on the patient? So being able to relate that straight back to the patient. So if you're collecting safety data, do people understand how that affects the safety of the patients? If you're collecting data in terms of making decisions in relation to dose escalation decisions, you're collecting efficacy data, which will have a direct impact in terms of a marketing authorization application, or just generally collecting data that can have an impact on the decisions that are then taken to manage that particular patient. So having a culture that enables people to understand what they're doing that impacts directly back to the patient, and that helps you to really understand why you're doing what you're doing. Obviously, in terms of systems, we expect good documentation practice, and also that includes electronic data. And by that, what I mean is, what we often see is that we've got nice new electronic systems in place in an organisation, but then the documentation side of that is reverted back to paper. So instead of keeping up to date and making sure your systems reflect what processes you've got, things like archiving of data, we've seen lots of data being printed out from electronic systems rather than thinking about how to archive that in the electronic version. Obviously, we need to define what the data checks are and also look at performance indicators. So those are indicators to see how well the company is doing, but also personnel. So personnel performance indicators are also really important. And what we have seen, and the question that we always ask is, the indicators and the measures that you have to see how well you're doing, what impact might that have in terms of culture and data integrity? So are you measuring your staff on the number of audit findings they get? Are you measuring them on the number of deviations that you're seeing? Are you measuring them on the number of critical or major findings they might have on regulatory inspection? And if you are, what kind of effect do you think that might have on your management culture and the open culture that we're trying to promote in terms of reporting any issues? Training is obviously also really important, and coming back to really being aware of what the data is that you're generating and what does that mean in terms of the visibility from the process that you're managing right down to the patient. And then also understanding the technical aspects of that as well. And by that I mean, if you're expecting people to review audit trails, for example, are your audit trails easy to understand? We're going to be talking about audit trails later on today, and from experience we've seen a number of audit trails on inspection where it's almost been impossible to decipher what exactly that is. So you can't expect your data reviewers to review audit trails if they're really not understandable at all. Just very quickly, this is a picture that I borrowed from a text on total quality management, and it just gives you an idea of really what problems are known to senior management and what problems might actually exist. And it's really to demonstrate that this line of communication needs to be addressed. So you can see from there that problems known to team managers are sort of less than 9%, and then problems known to executives, it's sort of a guess at about 4%. So if you want everyone to understand the rest of that 96%, then your senior managers also need to understand what the process is and get involved in that. And I don't mean by triggering a lot of audits and reviewing audit reports, but really have an understanding of the process, what happens to the data, what's the data life cycle, and what people are involved in that process as well. Finally, I just wanted to give you a few examples of some data integrity findings that we've had. So we've seen a number of issues with data integrity, or really lack of control of data integrity. So this example here, this is an example of a patient diary, and this captured patient self-administered injections. Whilst reviewing audit reports for this trial, it became evident that there were hundreds of changes in the patient-reported data, and this actually went across 6 trials. What happened was all these changes were made in an uncontrolled manner, so nobody authorized them, and there was no supporting source documentation from the patients in order to explain the reason for the change. And some of these changes were months after the IMP had actually been administered, so it's difficult to really see how accurate that data could have been. And on closer review, what it looked like was all these changes were made really to make sure that the IMP administration schedule fitted into what was planned for the protocol. So they're all changed back to what was scheduled for IMP administration rather than actually what the patients were doing in real time. This example shows lack of control of data changes post-database lock. So once the database is locked, we expect a high amount of control of any actions that are involved post-unlocking that database. So in this example, the database was unlocked in order to change an incorrect randomization number, but at the same time, it was also revealed that a number of other changes were made to the data. So there were changes around eligibility, changes around some other randomization numbers, and none of the changes were detailed, and neither was the reason for making all of those changes either. So these were all unexplained and unauthorized. Electronic health records can pose a challenge to research, generally because they're not usually designed with research in mind, and we've seen a number of issues with these. So this example here relates to the audit trail. So the electronic health record really wasn't fit for purpose in this case. So the audit trail would only be locked if the user actually manually locked it. So you could make lots of changes to the data, and only when you pressed lock at the end would those changes actually be saved. And there was no requirement for staff to lock records when they'd entered them, so there was no mitigation there for a poor system. So the audit trail didn't really show what had been created or locked or unlocked, but only didn't show what had been added or edited into the system. For this clinical trial, it started in 2012, but the audit trail didn't start until a year later than that, so a lot of that data was lost as well. So I know we're running out of time, so this is a slide just for your further information that's got some interesting reading for you. Finally, some challenge questions. So this is, again, a true or false. So organisations that report data integrity issues are viewed as less compliant by the regulators. So raise your hand if you want to say true to that. Raise your hand if you want to say false to that. Yes, correct, as I explained with the example with the serious breaches. So data integrity applies to which of the following? Electronic systems, paper-based systems, people and processes, all of the above. Raise your hand if you want A, B, C, and D. Thank you very much. Thank you.